Program Coordinator. Sarah is the State Floodplain Management Program Coordinator with the Wisconsin DNR. Even though she's new to this role, she is certainly not new to floodplain management. Sarah has experience in the construction industry, code enforcement, as well as most recently as a local floodplain manager. As coordinator, she works as a liaison between local communities and FEMA and works with communities on technical assistance, ordinance adoption, ordinance interpretation, floodplain program audits, and education. Sarah also chairs the membership committee for the Wisconsin Association of Floodplain, Stormwater, and Coastal Managers. Also joining us today in the background will be Mia Van Horn. She is a water regulations and zoning specialist with Wisconsin DNR, as well as Gabe Jackson. He's a floodplain and management specialist for FEMA. Sarah, if you don't mind advancing to the next slide, just a few points on Zoom etiquette. So you are all muted with video turned off upon entry. We would appreciate if you'd keep leaving your video off just to reduce chances of any issues with bandwidth. We do welcome questions throughout, but please either raise your hand or early on in the webinar, use the chat box to type your questions. If they're fairly basic questions that could use clarification and are appropriate during the webinar, I will try to interject and ask Sarah a few of those questions. Otherwise, we will be reserving the majority of questions for the end of the webinar. I also want to point out in the chat box, we've included a link to a webinar resources page that we've created. And there you will find a copy of the webinar recording, as well as some additional recommended resources that we will continue to add to. And at the very bottom of the page, for those of you who need continuing education credits for a variety of professions, you can find the forms and or links to report your attendance there. All right, so to get started, if you can move one more slide forward, Sarah, I'm going to launch a quick poll to see who's attending today. Great. So this should pop up as a little dialog box in front of you. And if you could just let us know what is your role or position, and certainly select all that apply. I know there's many hats that local government officials often wear, as well as let me know how many people are watching from your site. So we have 26 of 30 who've participated. We'll give you just a few more moments, and then I will end and launch the poll so we can see who's in attendance. All right, so the results should be popping up here. It looks like a majority of those attending are planning and zoning staff, 79%, followed by engineering and public works, a few floodplain managers, looks like maybe just one elected official and a few others. We also took a look at the registration list, and I know we have a variety of local governments joining us from the county, city, and village level, as well as a few consultants and other staff type folks from around the state. So thank you and welcome to all of you who joined us. At this point, I'm going to pass it off to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky. So I'm going to probably just turn off my camera, but I just really want to say thank you to everybody that decided to attend today. You know, my goal with the program is to just make sure that the education is out there. So I'm taking a lot of different paths to accomplish that. So with that, I will shut off my camera and get started. So this first webinar is floodplain management basics. We're going to talk about the goals of the floodplain program. We're going to talk about the role of FEMA, DNR, and the municipalities, and you know where those responsibilities lie. I'm also going to talk about the basics of floodplain zoning, and I think there's some just additional resources at the end. So, you know, one of the biggest goals of floodplain management is making sure that we understand risk, we know where risk is, and that people have the ability to protect themselves from risk. A lot of the information that, you know, the visuals we use like a 30-year, because essentially floodplain management really ties back to flood insurance on insurable structures. So in this graphic, you can see that over a 30-year period, 91 to 2020, there's not a single county within the state of Wisconsin that wasn't impacted by some kind of federal disaster. So, a big part of floodplain management makes it possible for people to have that protection in place. And also, it's really important to understand also that it's a condition of a mortgage on a floodplain property is having the flood insurance. So also what we're seeing as far as like climate trends, this visual kind of shows how, we are getting more rainfall. I've certainly witnessed it in my own community where, we're definitely seeing, like a week's worth of rain or a couple days worth of rain fall in a matter of a couple of hours. So that's definitely something that I've witnessed, and definitely a big initiative of identifying risk in the future is going to be looking at these higher rainfalls when they're doing the mapping process. So one of the big goals for the program is, having less damage, making sure that we have less damage with these subsequent events. So here we can see that flood damage per decade in Monroe County, we see that number going up. Essentially, the goal of floodplain management is to make sure that this number goes down. And by adhering to the floodplain ordinance and making sure new development meets those floodplain standards and making sure existing development is mitigating when they need to, would really help to bring these numbers into like a downward trend as opposed to what we have now. So floodplain management is essentially a partnership between the federal regulations, the state regulations, and the local ordinance. And the way that that works is we have the federal regulations set up by the NFIP, and they have minimum standards. So then every state is required to adopt those minimum standards, or the states can exceed them. So here in Wisconsin, we do exceed those minimum standards, and our code is NR 116. And then the communities have to either adopt what the state sets as the minimum standard, or the community can adopt even higher standards. So we want to make sure that the most regulation is occurring locally as opposed to from the top down. So we essentially build up or build down to it. So the management of development in the floodplains does result in construction practices that reduce flood losses. So by actually enforcing your local ordinance, you will wind up with less damage as a result of any kind of flood event. So the purpose and intent is to protect human life and health, to minimize expenditure of public money and costly flood control projects, to minimize the need for rescue and relief efforts associated with flooding. And, that generally comes at the expense of taxpayers when those things do occur, to minimize prolonged business interruptions, and to minimize damage to public facilities and utilities. So essentially the goal is to protect people, protect property, and limit any kind of interruptions. So, like I guess a best case scenario is that if you do have a flood event and it impacts a city park, like you really can't hope for better than that, unless you are a community that does regulate all development and prohibit development in the floodplain at all. So then in a flood event, you're essentially nobody's impacted, not your infrastructure, not your residents, not your schools or hospitals or emergency services or any of that. So, I mean, that's the best case scenario, but we also know that that's not necessarily possible when you have communities that were put in place before there was ever a floodplain. So, and that's where the non-conforming section of the ordinance comes in. So with the National Flood Insurance Program, they essentially are the mechanism behind floodplain regulations. So if you are a community and you do have development in the floodplain, if that development changes hands, those structures, homes, businesses, whatever the case may be, and they're bought out by another owner, with a mortgage, that mortgage will require them to carry flood insurance. So what the NFIP does is that it provides to communities the flood insurance so that their residents can be covered and be able to buy that property in exchange for the community adopting and enforcing the regulations. So basically there's I guess we kind of call it the three-legged stool of the NFIP. So all of these things are essentially funded by the NFIP. So first we have to know the risks. So we have to create the maps. And most mapping here in the state of Wisconsin is actually done by DNR mapping staff now, whereas other states, FEMA will hire a contractor to do that mapping. Most of ours are done in state by state mapping by our state mapping team. So the next thing is to insure your risk, insurance and outreach. One of the biggest communication things that I did as a local floodplain manager was, I went and talked to people about making sure that they knew that flood insurance was available. One of the biggest initiatives that I had for that was that with the intense rainfall events we were getting, like we had a bunch of properties impacted that weren't in the floodplain. So they're not required to have flood insurance. They're not required to meet any kind of floodplain management regulations at all. And they generally, a lot of those areas are like businesses, and because it was mostly in the downtown area. So it was businesses, there was a lot of renters and that kind of stuff. So making sure that they're aware, like if you have a street that is flash flooding in a rain event, it's really good to know that you have that coverage, and also explaining to them that a regular property insurance policy or a renter's insurance policy is not going to cover damages as a result of a flood. And then the last piece of this is reduce your risk. So that is ultimately where the local floodplain management comes in, and it comes in through different ways to mitigate. So it comes in making sure that when people do build in the floodplain, that they are doing so that it meets with the state regulations. So they're building higher, they're protecting their interests, they're making sure that they have dry land access so they don't wind up stranded during a flood event. That's floodplain management also comes in the way of mitigation projects. So that's on a singular property, like that could be elevating a home, relocating a home. You could acquire and demolish that home if you wanted to, and turn that into a park if it's repetitively flooded. Another way to mitigate your floodplain management is to there are other flood control projects you can do, like a flood control channel. There's levees. There's other different scenarios that you could do. You can do remapping to make sure that your risk is right. If you have an area that continuously floods, but it's not mapped as floodplain, it may benefit you to make sure that those maps are actually reflecting as close to what the risk is as possible. So federal role, this kind of ties into what I was saying before. Any community may exceed the minimum criteria that's established by the NFIP, which the state already does. And we actually do have communities in the state of Wisconsin that have even higher standards than what the state set. Yeah, I mean, we have some communities in the state that don't allow any kind of development in the floodplain whatsoever. So, you know, it's kind of cool being in this position and seeing the difference there, because I definitely came from a community that does not look at floodplain management in that way. You know, they look at it as, well, we already have thousands of structures in the floodplain that were there before the floodplain was there. So, I mean, you really have to kind of balance that line and understand that we have both kinds of communities here in Wisconsin. So the state role for floodplain management is, you know, we are here to provide technical assistance and training. You know, training is really big for me. I really enjoy talking about this, and I enjoy engaging with communities, because I think a lot of issues with floodplain management only exist because people don't really understand the ordinance, they don't understand the maps, how to read them. So I really take a major focus on education. So we also do community assistance contacts and visits. Um, Essentially what they are, the community assistance contact is basically a phone call where we kind of look at, you know, what is the situation in your community? How are you managing your floodplain? So that's essentially just a conversation. A community assistance visit is an audit. And I think not, I think next year, July of next year, they're going to actually start calling it what it is, because this comes down from FEMA. So but they're actually going to start calling them audits, which is accurate, because that's exactly what they are. So we also facilitate the flood insurance rate map remapping process. We review and approve community ordinances. We do make our best effort to attend community meetings, since we do have so many ordinances and things going on right now, where we're getting a lot of requests for people to, or DNR staff to attend community meetings as part of that adoption process. We just don't have the capacity to attend them all. And even if we wanted to, a lot of these meetings are set up at the same time. So, you know, we do make every effort. If there's a virtual option, I will absolutely attend any community meeting that you need me to, if there's a virtual option. So we also provide the model ordinance for the communities, and we inform and educate the public. So right now we do have a lot of staff turnover going on with our water management engineers. They will likely be your first point of contact when you do need technical assistance. So this map is outdated, but if you use the link here on the slide, that will be your most current information. So if you go to that link, you just search for your county, and that will give you who your water management engineer is in real time. So we have 2 new ones, and then we have 1 leaving. So yeah, just a lot of county coverage changeovers going on right now. So the local role of floodplain management is, you know, the local community has to adopt and enforce the floodplain ordinance. You know, minimize flood damage. All those projects that I was talking about, the mitigation projects, those projects are all started at the local community level. It is also the community's responsibility to issue permits for development in the special flood hazard areas. And I'm going to go into that a little bit here in a few minutes. Elevation data, it's very important. Documentation is very important when it comes to floodplain management, because you not only have to comply with the federal or with the state standards, but you also need to comply with the federal. So making sure that it's compliant there is really important. So you get used to having paperwork, because you need documentation for just about everything, and you're supposed to keep it basically forever. So it doesn't, any floodplain management records don't fall under the same retention policy that some of your other documents might. So keep that in mind. as you're, starting your program or, just working on your program, however you want to do that. A lot of time I spent in the job as a local floodplain manager was just doing flood zone determinations, helping people identify, what their BFE is and explaining, what they can and cannot do. And the local ordinance really does provide a roadmap for that. Also substantial damage and substantial improvement determinations. So substantial damage, whether it's a flood, a tornado, a fire, you still need to do a substantial damage on that structure if it's in the floodplain, regardless of the type of disaster. So I think usually in the fall, we do a substantial damage workshop. So that'll be in the newsletter probably when that is going to take place. And also substantial improvement. The state has a cumulative standard for substantial improvements. So each addition, remodel, modification, all of those things, they are tracked over the life of the structure. And once each one of those projects, once they're added up and they total 50%, then it would require that that structure be mitigated, elevated, fill in the basement, all that kind of stuff. Other responsibilities of the local community are field inspections. If you find violations while you're out doing inspections, it's your responsibility to address those violations through whatever your enforcement process is. You're also the first point of contact when it comes to the public. So when I was in that position, I always made every opportunity to educate the public. Educate the contractors, educate the realtors, because I promise you, the more that the public knows and those key players know, the easier your job is. Also, set up a filing system for your audits. And this goes back to the elevation data and all of that documentation I was talking about, because you need to have that on file forever. I guess one thing I would add to that is having those records on file is really useful if a property changes hands. So if you just have the elevation certificates on file, it's really useful for a new owner. It's useful for permitting. So if they're permitting some project, they already have this elevation certificate, so they may not need to get a new one to show compliance. So I used that documentation a lot.
Sarah, if I could interrupt for just a second, I'm
Sure.
interested in having people interact here a little bit. And so I threw a little question in the chat. I'm wondering if people would like to share best management practices for how they're maintaining their documentation. I know some people are getting quite sophisticated and recording it on the deed or putting it in their parcel database and so forth. So feel free to chat there. And then Sarah, you can certainly keep going on, but I think that's a really great point that you made.
Sure.
And you don't need to wait for the responses. You can keep going.
Oh, okay. All right. I didn't know if there was going to be a poll or something, but okay, cool. So state model ordinance, as I said before, the model ordinance is really a roadmap for how to develop in the different flood zones. So with our state model ordinance, I mean, it's a living document. So as we're working with communities and communities point things out to us, whether that be a discrepancy or something that just doesn't make sense and isn't legally defensible, like we will change and modify that document. But when we do make changes to it, we make sure to upload the latest version. We make sure that everybody that's working with communities on permit or ordinance adoption, that they're working off of the latest version. So I guess, probably most pointedly in the newest ordinance, there's Act 175 language, there's coastal language, and then there's also clarifying language in the flood fringe, campground, and removal of lands from the floodplain, as well as the cumulative 50% rule. But I'll definitely be getting into more of that next week for next week's session. But for now, if you're interested, this link will take you to our most current state model ordinance. Okay. So for communities that are not currently part of the NFIP, this is just an example of what that resolution looks like. And basically what you're agreeing to is that you're going to adopt and enforce the floodplain ordinance. You're going to review and maintain all of your permit applications, and you're going to address any known violations. The permitting here is probably the heaviest lift of this, because permitting is literally required for everything in the floodplain. It's required for all development. And development for floodplain management is defined as any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation, or drilling operations, or storage of equipment or materials. So when I look at that, I mean, that's such a broad definition that to me, that literally means everything. And that's probably the safest bet. I guess there is some flexibility there in that you don't need to necessarily have somebody who's going to change a light fixture in their house or something like that. If they're just going to swap out a simple light fixture, you don't necessarily want to get a permit for that. If they're changing out the faucet on their sink, so there is some flexibility, and you have to use your best judgment. And ultimately, your judgment is going to be based on your experience with floodplain management. So we have some communities that are, essentially, they've had bad audits. And, so they probably will be a little bit more strict on what they're going to require permitting for. They're probably going to be doing more field inspections and just floodplain inspections in general, where they're going to be driving around looking for things going on. Just because it's a really big deal that if you have violations and you don't correct them and you keep creating more and letting more slip through, your community can actually be suspended from the NFIP and lose access to flood insurance, which has, big impacts, because it impacts, it impacts future buyers. Anybody with a mortgage is not going to be able to buy that property. So you're cutting out an entire buying pool in your community if you lose access to flood insurance. There is a private flood insurance market now. So that is also an option, but from what I understand, private flood insurance is not available everywhere, and NFIP flood insurance is available everywhere. So just things to keep in mind as you're considering whether you're joining the NFIP, or if you're in a situation where you may be suspended from the NFIP, because we have cities and villages and counties in the state on both ends of that. So definitions and synonymous terms, there are a lot. There's a lot of acronyms. So we have the floodway, we have the flood fringe, we have zone AE, zone A, and then 1% chance, 100-year flood, BFE, regional flood elevation, special flood hazard area. Well, these four up here, they all mean exactly the same thing. And then special flood hazard area, high flood risk area. These are also synonymous terms. They mean exactly the same thing. So now that we've gotten through that part, what is the floodplain actually? So on this slide, I have a couple different examples. I have a riverine floodplain over here. So here you have your river. And your river is comprised of two parts. So you have something called the floodway, and I always think of that as a freeway. So that's where the water is moving. So that is the floodway, and that is the area that has the most restrictions for development. And then you have your flood fringe. over here on the outskirts, that's where it during a flood event, your water is just essentially it's going up or it's going down. It's not really moving. You know, it's just coming up or down. So, and then the whole area is considered the floodplain, but it really is important to identify which one of these areas you are in if you're trying to do any kind of development there to make sure you're meeting those standards. So in Wisconsin now we also have coastal mapping, which before this came into Wisconsin, you would normally find this along the ocean, you know, Carolinas, Florida, Texas, you know, but now we have them here because of the Great Lakes. So with the coastal section, you have the VE zone, and essentially the best way to describe that is anywhere where the wave height is greater than 3 feet. And then we have the coastal AE zone, essentially in Wisconsin. That area is treated and regulated exactly the same as the riverine flood fringe. So the flood fringe AE zone is exactly the same as the coastal AE zone when it comes to regulated development there. And then we have just the plain AE zone, and that is where the wave height is projected to be less than 1.5 feet. So this is just examples of the firm maps. How do you know what's in, what's out? And that is through a firm or a flood insurance rate map that identifies who is impacted by floodplain and who is subject to these regulations. So here we have the floodway. Remember I said there's 2 parts of a riverine floodplain. We have the floodway. This is where the water is going to be moving. We have the flood fringe or the zone AE, and this is where your water is going to be standing during a flood event. Here, well, then we have over here, we have the zone X. That is not considered regular. That is considered to be completely out of the floodplain. So that is the lowest risk flood zone. And then right here we have the shaded zone X. This is what we call a 500-year flood or a 0.2% chance flood. Although it might be on your maps, it is not regulated as floodplain. So when we're talking about floodplain regulations and floodplain management, we are only concerned with the areas that are on these maps when it comes to the NFIP. Now, you in your own community may have other zones. You may have flood storage areas. You may have, you know, areas downstream of dams that you have to regulate too. But when it comes to just the NFIP and compliance there, these areas on the maps are the areas that need to be regulated very well and documented. So this is an example of a coastal map. So with coastal maps, you wind up with all of these really kind of cool areas where you may have a project that overlaps a zone VE, a zone AE, and a zone AO. So like I said, your ordinance really gives you the roadmap for how to regulate each one of these areas. When you do have overlapping zones like this, you're going to use the one that is most restrictive always. So with this, where can I find the flood maps? The FEMA Flood Map Service Center, the Surface Water Data Viewer with the DNR, and a lot of communities have local GIS mapping. So if you have GIS mapping in your community, your GIS specialist can request these shape files and they could implement them in your own GIS maps. So another piece of the puzzle when it comes to you know, regulating your floodplain and identifying BFEs is something called a flood insurance study. And that has a couple of different data sets. This is where basically all the engineering information is input into this flood insurance study. So the most useful pieces of information here is going to be the floodway data table and also the profile. So generally, you know, you're going to use the firm, you're going to use the FIS. You're generally going to need to use both, unless you're in a zone A, in which case you're just going to be in a zone A and everything is floodplain and you don't have a BFE. So your firm and your FIS, you're going to be using those to identify the special flood hazard area. You're going to use those to identify the location of a specific property, to determine the BFE and determine locations of a regulatory floodway. So for this example, this is a Zone AE riverine flood fringe, and I'm not sure if you guys can see the numbers on there clearly, but we have a couple of different lines here. So at each one of these cross sections, this is where your BFE is. So each one of these cross sections correlates with something on the flood insurance study, which I'll talk about then. But say we have a project or a development that's going to be located here in this blue area. Now, I know this looks a little different than the FEMA maps, but this area here is floodway. We have this area here that's flood fringe, and then we have this area here that is the 500-year flood. So this tan area here is not regulated as floodplain. But if we have something right here and it's between these cross sections, then we know that our BFE is going to be 783.3. So you essentially use these cross sections to figure out. And if you have two cross sections and your developments between them, you pretty much know that that is the BFE at that location. But then in other cases, you're going to have your cross sections here. Wait, no, AR and AS. Okay, so for this one, say we have a development over in here, then we have a cross section right here that says 658.3 and another one over here that says 663.4. So which one are we actually going to be using? Like it's right in the middle over here. So we don't exactly know what our BFE is going to be here. So this is where the flood insurance study becomes really important. So between those two cross sections, we see that the regulatory BFE, this is always the number that you're going to use, is, yeah, it's between those numbers that this correlates with the cross sections on the map. So you basically use them together always. And then that is the floodway data table. And then the next one, this is the profile. So since we don't know exactly where our project lies here, and we don't have it landing right at a cross section and the numbers are different, we now have to basically use the flood profile to find the exact location so that we can find the exact BFE. So for this one, it looks like it's about 659, like 659.4. And one thing to keep in mind is that when you are getting to a point where you're using the flood profile to determine your BFEs, so long as you can justify it, like we're not gonna come at you and say, oh, you're using the wrong BFE. It should be 659.2 and not 659.4. No, like there is reasonable exceptions when you're getting to a point where you're using a flood profile to determine a BFE. So with the zone A's, you know, the big difference between a zone A and a zone AE is that we are not, you know, these areas are not surveyed. So we don't have base flood elevations. We also don't know where the floodway is and the flood fringe. So how do we regulate this area? Essentially, when you do development in a zone A, one of the requirements before you can approve that development is that they would have to essentially do a delineation first. They need to make sure that whatever they're proposing to put there is not going to wind up in the floodway. So before they can do that, they have to find it. And the way that that's found is, I got a spelling error, is a hydrologic and hydraulic analysis. This helps to determine the BFE. This helps to determine the floodway from the flood fringe. So it's commonly referred to as an H&H. I've also called it a no rise. Essentially, that's if you're doing development in the floodway, that's a main requirement of the floodway, because anything you put there, it creates an encroachment that can cause a rise in the BFE. So that's the big part about the development in the floodway. So this is just another example of the special flood hazard areas in our coastal mapping. So we have coastal mapping in, along Lake Michigan and also along Lake Superior. So I think most of the people in here are not in those coastal zones. So I won't spend a lot of time on this. So dam failure analyses. If you do have dams in your areas, there are dam failures that should be associated with those dams. And then the areas downstream of those dams shall be zoned and regulated. So there should be, as part of that analysis, a map and profiles that show that if the dam fails, what will be regulated downstream of that dam as floodway and flood fringe. I think a lot of the maps are available on the surface water data viewer, but not all of them. So it may have to be actually requested from the state or maybe even the dam owner. I'm not sure how all that works.
Excuse me, Sarah.
Yeah.
This is Mia. I just wanted to point out there was a note in the chat that Kewaunee County's on, and they do have coastal. So she just wanted to make sure you're aware of that.
Okay. Yeah, we can go back to this. Okay, so with the special flood hazard areas and the coastal areas, you basically have 4 different zones that you're generally going to see here. So as I said before, the VE is, that's where your wave height is greater than 3 feet. From the maps that I've seen come out so far, there really isn't enough area for anybody to build on that's considered VE, but it is still part of the ordinance regardless of if you have those zones, so long as you do have coastal. So the zone AE, we're essentially regulating that exactly the same as we would the riverine. So your development standards are exactly the same. The only difference between a riverine and a coastal AE is that in the riverine, you're in or out based on the ground elevation. In a coastal AE, you're in or out based on what the map shows. So that's just a very important difference between how those 2 zones are regulated. So, and then a lot of the zone AEs and the zone VEs have something called zone AOs and zone AHs behind them. So instead of having a base flood elevation there, they normally say what the flood depth would be. So the zone AHs actually do have a BFE, but the zone AOs do not. They will give you a depth, and then you figure out your BFE based on the existing ground elevation, and then you add whatever it says is the depth. So Wisconsin minimum standards, we do require 2 feet of freeboard. So if you're putting in a brand new construction, you have to elevate that living area, that living space, to 2 feet above. You can have a basement or a crawl space that is at base flood elevation. There should be fill around the structure that is 1 foot above the BFE, and it should extend 15 feet out. That structure should also have dry land access. There are exceptions in the ordinance for dry land access. You can get emergency services to provide like a written concurrence that they will still be able to access that site during a flood event. And if they can't do that, then you can also still allow that development if that property is made part of an approved evacuation plan. The state also prohibits most floodway developments, and we do have cumulative improvement standards and I guess the zero rise mapping standard. So that's what I was talking about when I said no rise and the floodway. So it's very important to know if you're regulating floodway or if you're regulating flood fringe, because anything in the floodway can potentially cause a rise of the BFE, and that's just not something that we allow here in Wisconsin. So do the minimum standards guarantee flood protection? I would say no, but they help. They don't absolutely guarantee. We don't know what kind of flood event we're going to have, and 100-year flood event that could happen multiple times a year. That could also be exceeded, but I guess we use that as our regulatory because, it's a fairly safe measure that we can use for insurance purposes. Like, these are the areas that we've identified that have the highest risk. They should have flood insurance. If they're flooded, they should rebuild in a way that they're meeting the floodplain regulations so that they're not creating and causing more damage. And essentially, we just looked at the maps. We know that flooding can happen anywhere at any time. Like, we know that that flooding doesn't always happen in the areas that are mapped, especially when we're looking at flash flooding, or urban development or urban developed areas with a lot of flooding. So it's important to know that just because you're not in a mapped floodplain doesn't mean that you're completely removed from flood risk. So with collecting high water marks, it's not something that you have to do. It is in the ordinance, but I do find that to be beneficial to point out your high water marks. What I've found in my career is that the memory that society has for these storm events is about the same as a goldfish. So, having these high water marks, if you do have a flood event, is kind of beneficial for risk communications in the future. And it's just kind of really nice to know. I was recently, or last year, I attended a conference, and this city had done a project where they basically just took flagpoles to show how high the floodwaters were for a bunch of different events. And it was really cool because as you're walking through it, I mean, you have that pole that goes 20 feet above you. So immediately when you walk through, it's an immersive experience because you're like, oh my God, like the water was 20 feet above my head for this flood event. So I think, having the high water marks is just a nice little piece of public information to have available. So this is an example of, how the Japanese historically marked that. This right here is a marker warning of, not to build there because of past tsunamis. So, it's kind of cool that even different cultures, different countries and very different time periods were also trying to build smarter, more resilient communities. So the community rating system, if everything that I went through sounds really good to you and you're like, well, I'm already doing all of these things. So your community may be in a position where you could benefit from joining the community rating system. And what that does is it basically shows that your community is really prioritizing your floodplain management. There are different activities that you can do when you join the community rating system. And by doing those activities and by submitting documentation showing that you've done all those activities, you can get insurance premium rate reductions for the policyholders in your community. So, and those premium rate reductions go from 5% to 45%. And some of those communities, or some of those activities, they involve public information. So what I was just talking about with the high watermarks, that would count as a public information. Mapping and regulations, You know, so if you take on a mapping project in your community, like you don't think the maps are right, so you want to have a consultant firm come in and remap, that would count. You know, even communicating the maps and flood damage reduction. So if you take on mitigation projects, if you do acquisition demolition projects, those kinds of activities would also count. And then flood preparedness. You know, if you have a plan in place for the event of a flood, that kind of preparedness and meetings and looking at your plan and updating it, that also counts toward getting points for your CRS. And that is everything. That's all I got, guys.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it. I think you did a really great job of connecting and explaining this in a very understandable manner. For me, the most difficult part is always thinking about the terminology and the acronyms, and kind of once you get conversant with that, then it becomes a lot easier to understand this. The other thing for me that's a little bit different, I talk with a lot of communities that do shoreline zoning, and there it's a distance from the ordinary high water mark. And so it's a little bit of a different concept for floodplain zoning where you're thinking about elevations. And so that's a really interesting concept to learn as well. So at this point, I would certainly invite others. I've been monitoring the chat and I haven't seen any questions that we haven't addressed so far. Feel free to type additional questions in the chat and we can facilitate those for the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar here. And I'd also welcome Mia or Gabe if you had any clarifications or additional items you wanted to add. We can do that as well at this point in time. All right, and Karen is reminding everyone about the webinar resources page. If you're wanting to go back and look either at the presentation as well as the recorded event, we've also thrown some resources up there providing an overview of floodplain management. One of my favorite links on there is the Wisconsin Floodplain Quick Guide. It's a very graphic one, so that's a great resource to look at.
And Becky, this webinar would be recorded and everyone that is recording, they would have access to the slides as well?
Yep. So we already have a copy of the slides posted. That's the first link. There's all three webinars are listed side by side. If you're looking on a website, if you're looking on your phone, I think they might get stacked. But each PowerPoint will be posted. Today's is already posted, and we'll go back in a day or two after we've processed the video and add that as well. Sarah,
Hello.
I have one question.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Was that Gabe?
Oh, it's just Gabriel. I just wanted to say thank you to Sarah. It was a great presentation, and I just wanted to comment on just the high water mark. There's a lot through this presentation, but what I thought was very interesting, that implementation of having the high water mark in your area, that kind of just stems into a broader, I guess, option for community outreach in general, and how community outreach just about the flood risks in certain people's backyards is certainly something that is something FEMA's been pushing quite heavily. So we're excited to work with our communities to really help broaden the community outreach aspect of floodplain management, because we do hear this, I think, a lot is I've lived here for 30 years and I haven't, flooded or anything like that. And people don't really know their risk, even though they're living in a high risk area. So I think that it was the first couple of slides showing the trends of increased rainfall data. That was very interesting, or flooding data. So I think we could kind of start showing these people that there is increased risk. I know there hasn't been in a while, and or for the time you've been here, but here's the future conditions, and we're trying to help you as much as we can. So yeah, community outreach is a big push for us, and we're excited to help our communities with it. But thank you and great job.
And Sarah, I have one more question, just a personal interest. You mentioned very early on about a number of communities that are exceeding the minimum standards. I'm wondering if you have examples. You don't necessarily need community names, but how are they typically exceeding? Are they thinking about regulating to the 500-year flood elevation, or how exactly are they modifying their ordinances? What's most common? What's most effective in your experience?
So I guess what I'm seeing in regards to higher standards, community wise is that they have certain areas of their community that are in floodplain and they're just refusing any kind of development of any kind. So we have some communities where it's like, okay, you can build in the flood fringe or in the coastal AE, but you have to remove it from the floodplain through a letter of map revision before you can build there. We have other communities that are like, absolutely not. You cannot build anything except a signpost. Excuse me. Except a signpost in the floodway or the flood fringe.
I got one more about with the higher regulations is, the way they calculate the 50%, they
Oh yeah, I forgot about
have
that.
the baselines at a higher rate, so the structure would reach that 50% more quickly. That makes sense.
If I'm not mistaken, Wisconsin has the cumulative standard, correct, Mia? So that's something that they also need to take into consideration for the higher standard.
Yeah, I think in those slides, I was specifically talking about communities that have chosen to adopt even higher standards than what the state has set as the minimum standards. And like, don't get it twisted, like the state has really high standards already in place. But it does allow developments in the floodplain. So if your community and your master plan looking forward doesn't include structures in the floodplain, then you may want to be more restrictive with your own ordinance.
Wonderful. We'll give just a few more moments if anyone would like to type questions in the chat. Otherwise, certainly come to our next webinar with some of those additional questions. We are going to be tackling ordinance adoption as well as administration next session. So that will be, I think we'll get a lot of questions there as we get into some of those details. And so Mia will be co-presenting with Sarah during that webinar. And for the third session, Gabriel will be focusing a little bit more on the coastal management, which is becoming more prevalent in Wisconsin. All right, folks, I'm wondering if Sarah, Mia, or Gabe, or anyone else would like to add any additional materials. If not, we can wrap up and I'll break for lunch.
I do not
None
have
from the FEMA
anything.
side? Oh,
Right.
sorry, Sarah.
No, that's okay.
Yeah,
Well,
none
once
from
again,
the FEMA side. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have anything either.
thank you all participants for joining. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.